Deanna was off this month. This is when
She
we-
off last month?
No, she was here last. This is the one she's on vacation.
Okay.
So who called you? You know,
All right, thank
who
you.
called you? I'm just trying to think if they called me.
How about Alliday?
Nope, they didn't call me, but I know the
They,
Alladay's got.
they may have been.
I said no. Chris.
So Bloomfield Capital might have
Yeah.
called.
Yep, I think that's who it was.
Mike Lucci.
Yep.
Okay.
30 seconds.
One thing that I'm going to comment
It wasn't
on,
Mark, it was Chris.
everybody's microphones are on. So, I mean, not that it's a big deal, but if anybody else is YouTube or whatever, we're picking up everybody's conversation. So either be careful to mute your mic or
Don't say anything bad.
whisper quietly aside. Yeah. And stop talking about Frank not being there.
And we are streaming live.
All right, we'll go ahead and call the Genesee County Employees Retirement System meeting to order. Madam Clerk, please take roll.
Amy Golden. Here. Mark Young.
Here.
Jeffrey Seifert. Here. Gary Pepin.
Here.
Dennis Russell. John Mandelaris.
Present.
Crystal Simpson. Present. Jeff Carpenter.
Here.
Tracy Kahn. Present. Roll's been taken.
All right, we do have a quorum present. Next item we have is communication items. Do you have any communication items, Jennifer?
We do not.
All right, moving on, we have item A1, Retirement Commission meeting minutes of May 10th, 2021. What's your pleasure?
Might speak. I was reading the minutes, and on page 2, the last action taken sort of bothered me as an attorney, Jeff, Frank. And I thought perhaps for more specificity, we should add a little bit more language to the action taken. Because as I look at it, it's sort of loosey-goosey. And I talked to the consultant, and perhaps we might be okay to do that.
To talk to a consultant?
Well, anyway.
Talking about the motion regarding the transfer of assets in the funds?
Yeah, comma, per ANCO recommendation on page 71 of the review captioned large cap summary. Anyway, that's my,
Okay, are you proposing to amend that accordingly?
well, it's up to Jeff, I guess, because he made the motion.
Actually, there has been no motion yet.
No, I'm talking about that motion.
Well, I think Jeff made the motion off Chris's
The original
recommendation.
motion last month.
Yeah, so,
Correct. Yeah.
so he just wants to make sure it has that we did it based on ANCO's suggestion, is what I believe, right, John?
Yeah, this is the motion made by Jeff, but of course, this is the secretary's minutes of that motion.
Right, so do you want to make the motion with this amendment? To accept the minutes with this amendment to it? With this change?
That's my recommendation, unless Frank has an objection to it.
No objections. I agree with the clarification. That's a good catch, John.
Okay, would somebody like to make that motion?
Before we do that, I have a question, if you don't mind, Chair. Since I was the motion maker, I have no problem with making reference to the recommendation by our investment manager, Chris, per page 71 of the material he had presented to us at the meeting last month. However, if we could just stop there and leave off large cap, what does it say, large cap summary?
He's basing it off this, right here, the large cap summary.
The caption of the section.
See how it starts, the large cap summary up
Yeah,
here? That's the caption he's referring off
Oh,
to.
just, okay. I thought he was trying to narrow down the specific type of investments. I'd rather not do that.
No.
Okay.
Just referencing the page it was on.
I'll make a motion to accept the minutes with the additional verbiage from John.
Okay, is there support for that?
I'll support it because it's not changing anything that I intended. It's just
Okay.
being more specific.
Been moved and supported to accept the meeting minutes with the additional language per recommendation on page 71 of review. Is it still captioned large cap summary?
Yeah, it's just the caption of it, yep.
So is there any further discussion of that? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. That's the longest minutes we've had since the last time we were live with John here. All right, moving on. No old business. Item C1, future meeting practices. I believe that is Jennifer and Frank.
Frank, I'll let you take that one.
Okay, sure. Thanks. So because this meeting is really the first meeting that's primarily in person for most of the trustees, next meeting with the expectation that it will be wholly in person, we just wanted to start a discussion about the board's future practices. Do you want it to be solely in person? Do you want to have a Zoom option? Do we want to stream on YouTube? You know, I feel like this board is an independent body, an independent entity, and you don't necessarily have to follow the county and what the county's been doing. So we really just wanted this to be an agenda item to get a discussion going, sort of, you know, take the board's temperature from there. So I can turn that over to Jennifer if she has more comments, or if board members have comments.
Just Tracy?
I would assume, since so many of us are already here in person, that the vaccination questionnaires were all turned in and everybody's vaccinated.
Frank, you say it would still be appropriate if this board so chooses to allow the option of some use of like Zoom meetings if we so choose?
Yes, so through virtual attendance could be appropriate for someone like Nick or myself or an investment manager. I think that would be completely okay.
We're not letting you off the hook. I'll let you know right off the bat.
And if you had a trustee who met one of the requirements in the Open Meetings Act, right? Someone who was unable to attend for a medical issue or military service of some sort, that would still be an appropriate reason to not be in person. So I think the option is okay. And as someone, you know, as a service provider, and even thinking of investment managers who are out of town, you know, rather than having them fly in, you know, you could provide a Zoom option. You know, members of the public might rather Zoom into a meeting than attend in person. There could always be a link. You guys have the technology in the room to do it. But I also don't think it's mandatory. I think it's, you know, a courtesy the board would extend to someone who couldn't be there in person.
So if, say, somebody wanted to take a golf trip to Phoenix next month, potentially we could basically allow that type of thing.
Well, I don't think that would necessarily.
Not for the trip, but for them to be on Zoom meeting in attendance.
Yeah, I think that the Open Meetings Act would technically tell you that for a golf trip or a personal trip, that does not suffice. It does not meet the
Okay.
it would need to be that someone is medically unable to get there. I guess I could make it a stretch argument and say, well, I'm physically impossible to be there since I'm in Phoenix.
That's not my intent. I just want to make sure that the board members have a little bit of latitude in the event that they need it or desire it. So
Sure.
that was all my intent was with that.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions? Jeff?
I do, yeah. Oh, Jeff, go ahead.
Well, I was making some comments. I think if we allowed the Zoom meetings going forward, it would actually save us money, because Frank charges us mileage for coming up here. And other people would do the same, other consultants that we use. this would eliminate that, and so it would actually be saving money. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to help me in my predicament but unless I'm medically sick or something, but other than that.
John?
Has the board taken any action with respect to the COVID? Because I'm unaware of a change in the board policy.
No.
And are we following board policy like the road commission is supposed to be doing and et cetera?
We are, at this point in time, under the state governor's executive order, we have to continue to allow the Zoom as long as there's a state of emergency that had been declared for the county. If and when the county revokes its state of emergency, then Zoom will no longer be required, and for the county board will not be allowed.
Doesn't that answer the question, though?
Yeah, I was under the impression the county board was either planning or had lifted that restriction, but I guess I'm mistaken there.
I'm not going to address that until the point in time when it becomes on a public record that the board wishes to address that issue. So,
Fair enough, fair enough. So let's assume that the county board does not lift the local state of emergency it has declared. Then the July meeting can look very much like this meeting. And we can say, for those who are willing to attend in person, here's the meeting room. For those who are not or cannot, Zoom is appropriate. So this sort of hybrid meeting format would work so long as the county's declaration stays in effect.
And the golf trip's back on.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll see you in Phoenix.
And I think, Frank, you and I were talking about the fact that we just weren't sure if this board was following the county board or if we were making our own decisions. I think that was the big question, because if we're following the county, I can just let you know the Friday before every meeting how it's going to be held as we find out. But this board could make, I thought, a decision. They can't make a decision?
I don't
Okay.
think you can override the county board. The county board is general jurisdiction over the departments of the county. Am I right, Mark?
I'd say you're right, but I would question, and I'd have to ask Frank whether or not this is a department of the county. I mean,
I
this
would
is
say-
a independent
Under the
commission.
aegis of the county.
So what'd you
What
say,
would your
Frank?
opinion be, Frank?
Yeah, I would say that this board in particular is a separate legal entity from the county. Certainly it's connected to the county in many ways. The county is the plan sponsor and makes contributions, et cetera. We certainly use county resources such as the meeting room and staff. But I do think that you're an independent legal entity. I don't think you're required to follow the county's guidelines. I do think if the county state of emergency is still in existence, then, this discussion's moot, right? I mean, we would continue to meet virtually or as much as we wanted to, right? I guess a question would come up, say, if the county lifted its restrictions and then the board wanted to continue to meet virtually, right? Then there would be some sort of contradiction there, but, perhaps this discussion was a bit premature. I was under the impression the county was either about to or had already lifted that restriction. So my apologies. But it's worthwhile to consider because we'll have to discuss it at some point going forward.
Yeah, I don't think you're necessarily premature. I think it's something that we need to look at and be prepared for going forward because, things could happen, first of the month, there could be a change on it. You just don't know when and until it becomes a matter of public record. So, I don't think this is premature. So I think I would recommend that as long as the board still has its declaration in place, that we do continue with the availability of Zoom meetings. And then once the county rescinds its declaration, then at that point in time, I would say that we should go ahead and plan on meeting live. Would that be acceptable, Frank?
Yeah, I think so. Yep.
So, is that acceptable to everybody?
May I make a request that Jennifer notify each of us individually if the board does make that change, so we know whether we can come or we have to come? Because I may be up north. I don't know.
Yeah, you can still get your email there, no?
Yes. Yeah.
So that way she could send out a group email that way, if that's agreeable to everyone. All right, thank you. Moving on, the next item we have, C2, Nyhart Presentation of Actuarial Valuation.
This microphone work?
Yep.
Testing. All right, hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all in person again. This is only my second meeting face-to-face this year, so it's very nice to get that started again. My name is Danielle Weingartner from Nyhart, and I have Nick Megos on Zoom. It was a little last minute, so he wasn't able to get a flight down, but he'll be here next year. All right, actuarial results this year look very good due to the asset performance. Assets earned about 8.77% for the year, so that really just makes everything better on a valuation results standpoint. No real surprises on the liability side, so the funded percentage showed some slight improvement and the contributions very similar to last year. We do have one assumption change that's been approved by the board. That discount rate continues to decrease by 0.15% per year. So it went from 7.4 to 7.25%. And that does increase your liabilities by about $10 million. But that is expected. Next year it'll decrease again to 7.1, and the year after will be at 7%. Note for accounting purposes, your auditors are requiring you to report all the way at that 7% now. So when you look at your accounting numbers, the liability is going to be higher on an accounting side than we show on the funding side based on that decision by the auditors. And that went into place last year as well. We do have a proposed assumption change. We talked about this the last year for sure, maybe even the year before, about mortality. That I'll get to in a couple pages. And again, that's something that the auditors are requiring on the accounting side. So on the accounting side, we'll use that 7% interest rate plus this new mortality table specific for public employees. Mm-hmm. Jennifer? Okay. Otherwise, I'll be trying to be vocal about page numbers. So.
Well, I know, we all had hard copies here.
And I can click. Or Nick, are you able to share your screen?
Let me try that, Daniel.
Okay, I'll put you on the spot.
Try that. No worries, I've got it up.
While we got a small break, Daniel, I'm gonna probably jump ahead and get ahead. I know we said 7.4, but like if you're looking at page 6, it says 7.25. I just want to make sure which.
Right, 7.4 was last year, and now we're moving to 7.25
So
this year.
2021, we're at 7.1 already. Okay,
Right.
Thank you.
We're at 7.25 for 12/31/2020. So 12/31/2021 will be at 7.1. Yes. All right. Well, I'll talk about mortality while Nick tries to get that up. Slide 4 on your presentation. So the Genesee Board agreed to a big mortality change a few years ago when a new Society of Actuaries table came out called RP 2006 with a new improvement scale. Thanks, Nick. We can see it here.
Okay.
And at the time, that study was done only on private employees, employees that worked for corporations, not employees that worked for public entities or specifically police and teachers and sheriffs. So in 2019, the Society of Actuaries released a new table only focused on public employees, general employees, road commission, firefighters, police. And what they found was that including police and fire, public employees do live longer than private employees. You have better health insurance, typically more stable positions. You know, there's lots of reasons why, but they did see mortality improvement. So the auditors are requiring plans to move to these tables. Michigan PA 202 uniform assumptions use these new mortality tables, and we feel like it is the best tables for your plan. If you look on page 5, here's a description of kind of that expected age. The improvement scale improves mortality as time goes on. So someone 25 years old today is expected to live longer than someone who turned 25, in the past. So as time goes on, people are expected to live longer and longer. So you see the new tables, on average, people live about 1 year longer than they do under the private tables. From your dollars-wise, it's about $12 million in liability, or about 1.8%. The contribution impact would be about $900,000 to adopt these new mortality tables. So I talked to the commissioner, and we'd like to add this as an agenda item for next month's meeting, to give you some time to think about it, and then formally adopt the mortality table or decide to postpone until next year. But again, it is required for accounting purposes, and we think it is the best mortality assumption going forward. It would be our recommendation to adopt it. Any questions about mortality? We could issue a preliminary evaluation report, and then if there's any changes, can we issue that after the fact for the audit? Mm-hmm. Okay. The results today assume those mortality tables are adopted, just so we can have a conversation. If we do need to revise the results, that's not a problem if you do want to wait and postpone this change to next year. I'll move on to slide 6, if there's any questions. Okay, Tracy.
Danielle, did you have a breakdown by employer for how adopting the new mortality table would affect our contributions in both scenarios?
I do not, but we can issue that before the next meeting. Just send that in an email to the board. I don't have that today. Again, it's about a $900,000 contribution impact spread out amongst all the employers, and it should be pretty proportionate, but I don't have that in front of me. It's because it's mortality, it's not going to impact one group significantly more than another. Versus retirement rates or something would have a more significant impact on a specific employer. Okay. All right, any other questions? Thanks, Tracy. All right, page 6 is the valuation results just in total, so not split by employer, showing the prior year column in the middle to the current year on the right. You see that interest rate moved from 7.4 to 7.25. So your unfunded liability did increase from $213 million to $220, and the big driver there is the 2 different assumption changes, that interest rate moving down and then the adoption of the new mortality table. Again, that could be removed if needed. The funded ratio increased to 68.1%, very similar to the prior year. And then the bottom section shows the recommended contribution. I did want to walk through these components. Normal cost, that is the cost of benefits for your active employees for 1 more year. So if your plan was 100% funded and you weren't paying off that unfunded liability, your contribution would be this $6 million with some interest. But instead, the plan is 68% funded, so we have to pay off that gap. And that's this $18 million here, paying off that unfunded liability. And there's some interest involved. Your employee contributions are $2 million coming in. That offsets the contribution. The remaining amount in total is $24 million. Again, it says city contribution here, but it is the contribution in total for all the different groups in the county. And we have this by group in a couple more slides. All right. Slide 7 shows a breakdown of the participant information. For general and sheriffs and mental health, those plans are closed. There's no new people coming in, so the active population is decreasing significantly. Last year, there was 110 actives in the general group, and now that's down to 81. In contrast, road commission, water and waste, those groups are increasing every year because active people are joining the plan. Any questions? And please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. Slide 8 looks at that liability. How did that move from 666 million down to up to 690? This shows the different pieces. Again, normal costs, those additional benefits earned every year is almost 6 million. That's reduced by benefit payments. About 50 million went out of the plan during the year. And then there is this line of interest. So assets are expected to earn 7.25 a year. At the same time, our liability is growing by that amount every year. So there is a big impact from interest. And then the two assumption changes together are 22 million. Again, 10 million from the interest rate change and 12 million from the mortality. Our expected liability was very close to the actual liability. So in total, everyone retired when I thought they were going to, pay increases were the same, everyone died when we thought. There weren't any big jumps there that we're concerned about. Questions? All right. You're supposed to ask more questions because we're in person. We can all, not afraid to unmute. All right. Slide 9, we look on the asset side. Hats off to Anco and Chris. The asset returns have been incredible. The last 3 years, the return's 8.1%. 5 years is 8.9% on a market basis. That's the red bar, shows your market return. And then we have asset smoothing in place, and that's the black line. So instead of having these big ups and downs in our market value of assets, we have a nice smooth line through those ups and downs for our smooth asset value. And right now they're about kind of right on top of each other, which is nice, versus in past years where the market value and the AVA have a larger disconnect. I guess that's on the next page. The AVA return is the black line, 9.1%. So you will have that 13th check issued again this year because that AVA return is so high and that hasn't been written out of the plan. Slide 10, sorry, I was referring to slide 10 when I was talking on the last page. Here's the red line is your market value of assets going up and down, and the black line is your AVA being that smooth line through the middle. Here your market value is slightly higher than the actuarial value of assets, and that's due to these positive returns the last few years. It's very nice when we have a downturn in the market for that smooth value to be higher, but when the flip happens, you have the opposite, where the asset number that we're using to develop our contributions is lower than that market value. I think for accounting purposes, the plan is, I don't have it in front of me, 64% funded. But again, you're using that lower percent. Questions there? All right, Nick, feel free to chime in. Okay. Slide 11 is the historical funded ratio of the plan. This is just nice to see the progress. We'll show on the projection slide, but if the asset returns are made over the next years, this return should start going up. This funded ratio should eventually reach 100% if we're hitting that 7% return every year. So we'll see that on the projections, but for now it's been decreasing or pretty steady, based on asset performance and some assumption changes that have been made. But a lot of that has to do with 2008 and 2009. You have 1 or 2 bad years, it can really hurt the funded ratio. All right, slide 12. We see some things based on individual employers. Again, everything looks very similar to last year. You'll see the funded positions of the plan. We have the unfunded liability written out here, and then the funded percentages in the charts below. In total, the plan's 68% funded, but that varies widely by employer. One item to note.
Danielle, I would say that part of the reason we're not seeing the a big increase there is we do have a little bit of time before we're going to fully recognize the asset gains that have happened. And that's that difference in market value and actuarial value we saw here on this page. But also every year we've been absorbing a 15 basis point decrease in our return assumption, which automatically, when we recalibrate and remeasure everything at a lower interest rate, that puts a little bit of a challenge to show tons of progress in the funded percentage. Where we're going to see that funded percentage hopefully improve a lot is once we settle in at that 7% assumption and we're not reducing the interest rate, as we're trying to get to where we think we should be. And undoubtedly, the other thing is, as we saw on a reconciliation of liability a few pages back, we are saying that, there's two things going on with these assumption change. One, I just talked about $10 million to go from 7.25 to 7, or from 7.4 to 7.25, but then this 12.4 that Danielle already talked about on the mortality side that we could decide to not accept at this point and postpone. So I think there's a lot of good things happening, probably not quite as much improvement as we'd like to see here in this funded percentage. But again, we've got some headwinds in terms of the interest rate going down each and every year. So just some perspective there.
That's a very good point. In the last 4 years or 5 years since 2015, you've been adding $10 million to your liability every time you decrease that discount rate. Rather than taking that all at once and you smoothing it out, but then we're not seeing any movement on that funded ratio.
Yeah.
So back to slide 12 with the individual liability shown. One item to note is mental health has a $30 million unfunded liability. In March of 2021, they did put in $27 million into the plan. So when we look at this next year, the health group should be very close to 100% funded. So they made a very large contribution, and we're able to get that in a much better position. The next page shows the recommended contribution, again, by group. The first row is last year's numbers, and then the third row is this year's numbers, fiscal year 2022. Again, mental health, we will be able to revise or add an amendment to the report showing what that contribution will be with that additional $27 million in. We cannot report that contribution as a receivable or add it to their assets now because the measurement date is 12/31/2020, and that was something the auditors said would not be permissible, but we can show that contribution amount for fiscal year 2022 will drop to about $1.2, $1.3 million because of that large contribution.
Yeah, and the majority of that, Danielle, is going to be them just paying for the benefits that the folks they still have accruing will be earning during this year, right? And maybe a small gap in unfunded liability after that contribution, but most of it's just paying for benefits moving forward.
Right. And that's something we explained to them, yes, you can fund to 100%, but your people are still getting benefits, so you have to pay for benefits that are earned. And for them, it's a little over $1 million. Okay. Moving to slide 14, Michigan PA 202 state reporting. This was new 2 years ago, where the state of Michigan requires reporting on the funded percentages of the plans on an accounting basis. So again, this is the adoption of the new mortality table and the new interest rate, and it is by division. So you see the reporting here by division. The first row, funded percentage under plan assumptions, is what's reported to the state and what determines if a corrective action plan is needed. If a group falls below 60%, they have to come up with this corrective action plan that shows how you're projected to become better funded and all these changes you're going to make to become better funded and what your 10-year plan is to a board. Everyone is above that 60% threshold. The general group is getting closer, at 64%. Where that may be a concern and something to watch out for. You do have a closed amortization approach, which is something we've talked about a lot in the past, but where you are scheduled to become 100% funded in 23 years. So that corrective action plan, I think, would be relatively simple, where you would say, yes, we're on track to fund to 100%. We don't feel like we need to make changes to the plan. We're on track to do this, but it is still another hurdle to have to jump and process to go through. So we would just really like to stay above 60% and avoid that. The state also issues uniform assumptions every year, and you are required to report under these uniform assumptions. One of them is the interest rate, which is set at 7%, and the other is mortality, which is that new public mortality table we talked about. So for accounting purposes, you're right in line with those uniform assumptions. So the funded percentages are exactly the same. On the funding side, there's that gap because we're slowly getting down to 7%, and mortality we haven't officially adopted yet. And that gives the state a way to look at plans on an apples-to-apples basis. If one plan is reporting at 8% and another's reporting at 7%, their numbers look very different. So they do want to see all the numbers on one basis, but that does not impact if you're considered an underfunded status and need a corrective action plan. That's just for reporting. Well, that concludes our 12/31/2020 results. We do have some additional information we'd like to go through. Starting on page 16, we have some benchmarking information, just kind of as an FYI. The first is where public plans are on their interest rate assumption over time. You see in 2008, the average was closer to 8%, and now in 2021, it's down to 7.15. So you're in a very great place there at 7.25 and moving down to 7%. Slide 17 is just some additional benchmarking information. This is a separate study, the NCERS study. So the interest rate here is 7.25, 7.26 is the average. Again, right where you're at. And the amortization period on average is 23 years, which is also where your plan is at. So very nice to see that you're not an outlier on any of the assumptions. Slide 18. We do have this best practice scorecard for the board. We wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this. Your plan is, and your board is doing incredibly well on our scorecard here. There's really no red flags or issues that we wanted to bring to your attention. You do have a written funded policy. You have a very good amortization method. We talked about that a couple of years ago about moving to that closed amortization method. We do look at your discount rate every year, and you've been actively lowering it. The one item in yellow is completing an experience study regularly. It looks like the last experience study was done in 2015, and that's when we review not only the discount rate and mortality, but the other assumptions like retirement rates and salary scales and termination rates. PA 202, that Michigan law, does require an experience study every 5 years, but that law went into place in 2018. So technically, you wouldn't need one until 5 years after that, unless the board would like to do one 5 years after the last study. So Tracy, I don't know if you have any memory when you were here about if the board did this every 5 years or if it was stretched out longer.
Excuse me, Tracy?
So yes, the last one was based on a 5-year time period, I think that ended in 14, I believe, is the one that I facilitated. So yes, we're due for another one, through 19.
And I'm less concerned about it than I normally would be because we've been looking at the discount rate and the mortality every year. And those are the two assumptions that can really drive costs. But that salary scale is a big one too. We've seen salary increases so much lower the last few years than may have been 10 years ago. So that may be a good one to look at where you would actually see some savings on your plan costs. So that's something we could add to a future agenda to have the board decide if you wanted to do an experience study or not. But I thought I would bring that up and at least have an initial conversation.
Yeah, and I would mention just in my recent experience that the three most recent Michigan experience studies that I did, two of which were for counties, there was a significant savings overall in the demographic assumptions from the standpoint of salary scale across all three of those was considerably, the salary experience was considerably lower than what we were currently assuming. I think in a couple of those instances, just anecdotally looking at your assumptions relative to what some of those were, some of those, one in particular had a very old assumption, which was expecting, you know, pay increases in the 5 to 8% range for everyone. You know, you're really in the 3 to 7, depending on how long a service someone has and how old they are. But we still think over the last few years that the salaries haven't increased the way the scale would suggest. The other two demographic assumptions that we would, you know, there would be a decent amount of work on would be retirement and termination. And, you know, we would look at that division by division and try to make sure that we're anticipating correctly when people are leaving employment. Typically, when you look at those things, the retirement assumption is the one that can have a more powerful impact on liabilities than the termination assumption. But, you know, as we work through year by year, we always look at gain loss. Maybe nothing huge has stood out, but yes, it's probably about the right time to look at that again and make sure we're getting those assumptions as correct as possible. But to Danielle's point, the two assumptions that we talk about a lot, mortality and the interest rate, you know, we talk about them a lot because they do have the most powerful impact. And frankly, there's been a lot of information and discussion about those two assumptions in the last few years. On the interest rate side, you know, back in the day when we could go to MAPERS conferences, you know that there was a lot of discussion around what's the appropriate assumption. PA 202 has also highlighted the interest rate discussion in that, you know, it was brought forth to us that every state plan except one has a return assumption that is less than 7. And that's, I think that combined with just the general trend downward that Danielle just talked about amongst surveys from places like NASRA and NCEPRS would suggest that that's trending downward. However, the board is recognizing that we're moving towards 7. On the mortality side, there's been a lot of discussion there because of this public pension plan study that became official and released in January of 19. So, and frankly, auditors have pushed us very hard on that because, you know, it is public pension plan specific, and we get a lot of questions when we're not using it. So that's why we've discussed it probably more frequently than just an experience study would suggest.
And Nick, I think you meant all states are below 8%, correct?
In terms of what I'm saying is that if you look in the PA 202 memo that justifies the uniform assumptions that they've recommended, if they look at one of the things they mentioned is every state ran.
Oh, Michigan,
plan
the Michigan state plans.
8 in total. Yeah. MERS is the only one that's above 7 right now. Everybody else, I believe, is 6, 8, 5 or lower. So that was one of their justifications for their 7% assumption. So yes, the NASRA, a few slides back here, those are statewide plans. That's what that survey is based on. But you know, I don't think I don't get as excited about that survey because frankly, it's statewide plans and they've been slower to move on that assumption, but there is definitely a trend downward. But yeah, you know, on the PA 202 uniform assumptions memo, they were very specific in listing every one of the plans that are ran by the state in Michigan, and there was only one that was above 7 currently.
Thanks, Nick.
Yep.
All right, I'll move through this quickly. On slide 19, a few more best practices, updating the mortality. Your mortality is in a very good place, even if it is, this new table is not adopted until next year. You're still using the latest and greatest improvement scales. Asset smoothing, you have that in place. And then your actuarial equivalents. So for plan administration, if someone goes from a life annuity to a 50% joint survivor, they do take a hit. Their benefits reduced because they're getting it over them and their spouse's lifetime. That actual equivalence is done on an actuarial basis using a mortality and interest rate assumption. And some plans have incredibly outdated assumptions for that. They're using 2% interest and 1971 mortality. Yours is actually very relevant at RP 2000 and 7%. So that's not a concern for us. There's been several lawsuits going on right now, like the Pepsi companies sued because those actual equivalences are so outdated. Participants are saying, well, I'm taking too big of a reduction. So we want to avoid that and not be in a position where you could be sued. Slide 20, annual valuations you're doing, reviewing annual cost projections. This is something we do every year as part of our presentation. We show the funding contribution going out 20 years. If any of the individual employers would like to see projections based on their specific group, that's something we can do as well. We don't bring that to the board, but something we could sort of do on the side. And then having annual meetings, and obviously your board meets quite frequently, and we try and come out once a year. So all in all, this best practices scorecard, feel free to read the details, but your board's just doing an incredible job, and I think the plan's in very good shape. We go to slide 22, skip over here, the projections. Again, this is a projection out to 2050. We started doing a closed amortization approach a couple of years ago. So we took the large unfunded liability and amortized that over 25 years. So like you took a 25-year mortgage out on that large unfunded liability. And we are doing layers. So if there's any new gains or losses or new assumption changes, those are then smoothed out over 25 years. But the bulk of your unfunded liability has 23 years left. So we think in about 23 years, the plan will be 100% funded. It grows slow. That's that black line. In about 10 years, we expect you to be 80% funded, and then in 23 years, that grows to 100%. The biggest driver here is your asset returns. This is assuming in a 7% return going forward. If every year the plan only hits 6%, that gets extended out, and you won't be 100% funded in 23 years. So something to keep an eye on, but we like to see that recommended contribution are those red bars. Those are generally decreasing as those the general and sheriff's plan and mental health are closed. There's no new people coming in. That contribution does go down. That concludes our presentation. I think next month we'll have maybe just a one-page exhibit showing how the contributions impacted for each employer for that mortality change. And Jennifer, if we can add an item to the agenda to have that voted on.
Thank you very much. You did a great job. One question I do have, and this is for Crystal, not you. Crystal, you said that we needed to adopt the change of the mortality tables now as opposed to later?
Our audit is due to the state of Michigan by the end of June. The 12.4 million is probably not material for GCERS as a whole. So when we're just looking at our set of financial statements, we're probably fine. But we do that separate statement of fiduciary net position by employer. And so that allocates each piece to each employer. So City of Mount Morris's materiality is like $450. So the auditors won't have a problem as an overall picture, but they may have a finding on that separate audit if we don't adopt that mortality table. So before we postpone it, I just wanted you all to know that.
Okay, and then the other recommendation that you made, Danielle, is the experiential study and that. So I guess as opposed to putting that issue off until next month, since there is a time frame and some constraints there, I'd recommend that we go ahead and accept and file the report and follow the recommendations of the actuarial. If anybody would like to make that motion.
The motion.
It's been moved, it's been supported. Is there any discussion?
I just had
Tracy?
one question for you, Danielle. You said it was going to the new mortality table was going to increase our liabilities by the 12.4 million, but you said it was only going to affect the contributions by, did you say 900,000?
In total.
Over all the,
Yes,
all
yes.
employers? Okay. I'll make sure. I
And
heard
again,
you
that
right.
should be somewhat proportional. I don't have my calculator here, but.
Okay, gotcha.
That way we'll be nice to Danielle and not make her go through the process of following up on that with us, so. All right, we do have a motion on the floor that's been made and properly supported. Is there any other discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
Excuse me, through the chair to Danielle, before you leave. Do you perform actuary services for other multi-employer plans where one or two of the employers are closed funds?
Yes.
So we're not unique in that. Okay. How do we compare with your other entities that have this type of situation where we have closed employers within the fund in reference to funding levels?
I think you're slightly lower funded percentage. I'm thinking of like Monroe County is better funded, but it's smaller as well. Nick, I don't know if you can speak to.
Yeah, I
St.
would
Clair's.
say Monroe County is ever so slightly better funded, but not tons better than Genesee. St. Clair is more significant, but they've been closed for a while and have been working towards funding up for quite some time. But yeah, I mean, that particular plan is better funded. I don't necessarily think that the funding has as much to do with being closed or open, frankly. It has to do with the funding policy, because whether you're closed or open, once you have a funding policy that is set up to pay off the unfunded and has good assumptions, you're going to work your way through that either way, because even if you're open, you're paying your normal costs, but then you're also paying on your unfunded. So where it does cause some confusion sometimes for boards is most of them are set up the exact same way you are, which is, and what I mean by that is they have a closed level payment on their unfunded. In other words, their payment on unfunded looks just like if we did a mortgage calculation, whereas an open ongoing plan does a level percent of payroll payment on the unfunded, sort of setting up their payment to actually go up as a level percent of payroll. But in terms of plan governance, that split to recognize the difference between your different divisions in terms of participation, you're doing all the right things, and have a plan that really is this projection suggests gets you to where you want to go, which is 100% funded, where you're just paying those normal costs year by year.
And I think that closed amortization approach where you're planning to be 100% funded in 23 years makes a huge difference, where 5 years ago we had that open where we were constantly paying it 30 years, 30 years, 30 years. So I'm not concerned about your funded percentage. I think by having that plan to pay it off, you're in very good shape.
Mr. Chair, I got just a general question. It's kind of off the evaluation, but has to do with Nyhart. I know last meeting we talked about buying service credits, and Nyhart gave a presentation. I thought Frank was going to come back with some information, but I didn't see it part of the agenda or anything. Did we not put it part of the agenda or anything?
Yeah, I can jump in there. Jennifer and I are working on revisions to that policy. They weren't quite finished yet by the time the agenda was going out. So I thought instead of just rushing it and getting something in front of you, we would just postpone it to July. So that way you can see, clear language that Jennifer and I agree on. I'm going to send it to Nick too, actually, to make sure that he agrees with the way I phrase things in that policy. And then as we went through, right, it was that service credit purchase policy encompasses all of the possible purchases, not other governmental service. So I didn't want to just sort of piecemeal those revisions and say, oh, we're only making changes to this subsection. I want to look at the whole document. So we'll likely have a couple items, just clean up, clarification, One example is we're using the old term for Jennifer's position, not the current title. It's just some basic things like that I want to make sure we catch. That's why it's not in front of you today, but it will be on the July agenda.
And I did also send an email to each one of the employers because Frank wanted to make sure it wasn't in any of the contracts. Rather than me go through 13 county contracts and all the contracts, I checked with each HR, so it took a while to get that back.
Well, like I said, it just when they were going through the presentation, just like a flash bulb.
Thanks.
All right, one item we did, since we just passed to do an experiential study, Crystal, could you kind of advise us what the way to do that going forward is? Mm-hmm. Okay, would we be using Nyhart for that, or would we be putting out an RFP?
Did not, I did.
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt. I can't hear Chris. I can't either.
You're breaking up there, Frank.
I was just saying I couldn't hear Crystal, so I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I would think that they have a lot of the data that we'd be providing anyway, so I think that makes the most sense. I just don't know if the board feels comfortable not putting it out to bid. That would be a board decision.
What's the cost on that approximately?
Typically, it's about 80% of our one-year valuation fee.
So back to my question,
Nick,
what's the
what is that
approximate
number?
cost of that?
Is that 18,000?
Yeah. So I think that typically it is 80%, but given that we have a plan already in place on the investment experience, the investment assumption, and also we have a mortality that's, I'll say, somewhat dictated to us by this public pension plan study. We're not really looking at a ton of experience there. You know, it's probably going to be more like 70%. So we're thinking it's in the $26,000 to $28,000 range. I'd be happy to write up the formal proposal and have you vote on it next month. That's what we've done for other plans. We've laid out exactly what we'll do. We'll give the budget, and then you guys can formally approve it. Because from our perspective, Mr. Chairman, we really just want to have it done going into next year's valuation. That's where we want to have it in place. So we've got some time to get that done. But would actually feel better to formalize the offer, and if that works for you, and you can vote on it formally in July.
Nick, I pardon my hearing here, but I seem to have heard 18,000 was the estimate based on 80,000 or 80% cost of the actuarial. Is that correct? And then there was 26 or 27,000 based on 70%.
No, I think that it was. I don't know where the 18,000 came from. 80% of the valuation fee is a lot of times where we would start. We think that given we already have a head start on the interest and mortality assumptions, we would do 70%, which would put us down around 26,000 to 27,000. I've got to look at what this year's valuation fee is, but I think that's right around where we would be. So about 26 to 27,000.
All right, thank you. Jeff?
A question for Crystal. By postponing this till next month for the proposal to come in, is this going to have a negative impact on your audit concerns that you?
The experience study?
Yeah, yeah.
No, that would have no impact on the current valuation.
The experience study wouldn't go into effect until next year. So we would be able to do the experience study in November, December, and then next year's report would reflect those changes.
That was only on the mortality table, Jeff?
Yes, that we already.
Excuse me.
approved, So we're all set with
We got a few balls we're juggling here, and I want to make sure we're not doing something.
We approved the resolution for that, so we're all set for this
Okay.
year. And then we'll do the experience study that will
All
have
right.
implications in the future.
Right.
All right, I think we're caught up now, right?
I think I am.
So
Thank
we'll
you.
have a formal proposal for July's meeting for the experience study.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Right, moving on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate you coming. Next part we have is item C3, Enco Consulting.
Motion to approve, oops, excuse me. No, I'm not going to approve that yet.
Didn't hear a word yet. Thank you very much. So slide 9 in your packet is the May update. And that's the one-page handout if you're here in person that has the colorful little boxes in the upper right-hand corner. So, John, it's underneath the NIHART presentation. I put your handouts there. And so, May was, I would say, the first month where we actually kind of took a breather in the markets. If you look at the numbers here, you'll see the S&P 500 was up 0.7%. So we had been clipping along a little bit better than that up until May. And you'll note if you come down that list that Russell 1000 growth actually was negative. So we continue to see that rotation that started kind of fourth quarter last year where value stocks have done better than growth stocks. And that was true this quarter. Now remember, April was the reversal there where we actually saw growth come back a little bit versus value. But as I said, now we're back on that trend that we've seen for about 6 months with value taking the lead. And you can see value was up about 2.4%. So pretty big difference between growth and value in the month of May. Once again, small caps, though, were kind of the weakest performer there. You can see they were only up 21 basis points. So as I said, kind of a lighter performing market. Now, I'll tell you June has kind of reverted back to kind of some of those earlier months, and we're hitting all-time highs, it seems like, on a daily basis. So we're looking at a pretty good end to the second quarter if we can make it through the next couple of weeks here. We did see interest rates kind of moderate during the quarter. And so if you look at the U.S. Ag, it was up 33 basis points. That's the second quarter in a row we've actually saw positive results after second month in a row that we saw positive results after having 3 negative, like -1% type numbers in the first quarter. So you see the year to date, we're still down over 2% in core fixed income. But as I said, at least this quarter, we've had a couple decent months there as interest rates have kind of steadied themselves. And, hopefully we'll see more of that here throughout the rest of the year. We don't want to see those rates just climbing higher and higher as we go forward. So any questions really market related? If you flip over, I do have updated market values for you. This was as of the end of last week or about a week ago. Note, we still see that low vol listed there. And I'll let Frank tell you a little bit about that under his report. Last week, we did get that shifted out of the low vol in the S&P, but it took us, I would tell you, probably about 3 weeks longer than I anticipated. And as I said, Frank will give you the update there. I think the good news is if you look at the bottom line, 531, remember we just saw the actuarial report. They're at about 470 for assets as of year end. Now we did get the contribution in for the mental health. That obviously was a big chunk of that performance, but the markets have also been helping us here in 2021 push numbers higher. So we're slowly but surely creeping up on that 690. I see as kind of my target now. So, and from a distribution standpoint, there'll still be a little bit over in the cash. That's the one that we continually have a little excess there. We do spend a lot of money, though, on a monthly basis, and we have some new commitments. The TerraCap and the Alidade are coming on board, and you'll see that they, we have to be prepared. I think we saw from TerraCap they're expecting a relatively sizable capital call here in the near future. So, any questions, kind of market value related?
Can I jump in on that low vol strategy now?
If that's all right.
Okay. So as Chris mentioned, that transition took significantly longer than we had anticipated as well. Our firm had negotiated with Comerica on the exact same product for another retirement system. We had sent over the exact same agreement that was approved with that other county retirement system. and Comerica objected to a number of the provisions that they had already agreed to with a, very similar client. Aaron in my office exchanged numerous emails with the Comerica people. We just could not understand why they wouldn't accept the same things that we had literally just negotiated with a similar client. He was getting together with their legal counsel. They insisted on going through their sort of client reps instead of legal, so we couldn't talk directly to legal. Finally, when we pointed out, look, here's the contract for this other retirement system, and here's the contract that we provided to you. It's the exact same document. Why are you objecting to this language now? They finally agreed to the same changes that we were insisting upon. And they weren't insignificant changes. I mean, we weren't talking, them versus his or his and her. I mean, we were talking about liability and indemnification clauses and issues that if Comerica wouldn't have agreed to them, we would have recommended that you not make the transition, honestly. And thankfully, it was pretty much, the beginning of last week, I think, Chris, maybe even the end of last week, where we finally got everything buttoned down and we were able to move, start with, finalizing the documents. But yeah, it certainly took significantly longer than I think it should have for that to work out. But it did. It's finally in place, and Chris can probably state when the assets will be transferred better than I can, but it sounds like they're starting to be moved.
They moved on Thursday,
Okay,
last Thursday.
There we go.
So, I mean, they were really quick. Once we got the signed contract, they went really fast. But it took us a long time. And I was kind of on those chains and the email chains. And Aaron literally pointed out, like, you are now striking your own clause from your own contract. So his frustration level was pretty obvious in the emails.
Yeah. It was getting silly.
Yeah. So when you see something like that between attorneys, like there's something else going on there. So any other questions about that?
I just had a question on the Terra Cap and that 29 million uncommitted. That is actually really just not committed, or 20 something.
Yeah, and so the Alidate hasn't even been added to this, as we're waiting on contracts still to be finalized on that one. So there is a lot of that money has been committed. So, yep.
Jeff?
Through the chair, to Chris, our cash account right now is, 17 million?
Yes.
Now, you're holding that because of the commitments, waiting for...
Partly, as I said, I believe I saw an email from TerraCap saying they were expecting to call about 70% of the capital, like in the next week or so. So that'd be like $7 million. And we do spend, I want to say, about 4 each month. So it can go down pretty quickly. It's been a while since we've seen any actual capital calls. Instead, we've been seeing a lot of money coming back, distributions from the GCERS and the prior Alidate funds. So we keep getting more money coming in than going out, but I think you're going to see that turnaround. And in talking with Alidate, if you remember, I think they've already bought a couple of properties for Fund 5. So they should be issuing a capital call associated with that one as well, as soon as they finalize their last or their first close.
Thank you.
All right. So the other report's the asset allocation study. So we had started talking about asset allocation a couple months ago. And on, it would be page 1 if you're here, it would be slide 12 if you're following along. So we do have some background information and some conclusions for you. On this page, I'm going to kind of walk you through the report, and then maybe we circle back here at the very end. So we move ahead to page 3 or 14. Just kind of a quick little outline of what we're looking at doing, setting of the objectives. Actually, part of that's what we just walked through with Danielle. right? That's 7.25, moving to 7.1, moving to 7. That's one of our big objectives. Trying to get to 100% funded would probably be another one of our objectives, and probably trying to get there in, I say a prudent fashion is probably part of that as well. What we're going to be looking at today is, at least the beginning of the process, is talking about risk. What risk are we comfortable with? And, how do we want to allocate these funds that we have available? Is everyone comfortable with the different types of strategies? And so we'll be talking a lot about risk, about the asset classes. Those two kind of go hand in hand, because the asset class usually is what's exposing you to that risk. And then we have some model portfolios to take a look at, and we'll circle around at the end on potential recommendations for you. Page 4 kind of mentioned a little bit of this, starting with the target return. So we use 7.25 as our target return in this, as that's kind of your current rate, recognizing, we want to be somewhere in that 7% range longer term. And then when we looked at asset classes, I included what I would say are kind of the popular asset classes amongst Michigan public funds. So went kind of to both spectrums, cash, fixed income, all the way out to private equity. And then we put in kind of the allocation guidelines that 314 put on us. So 20% in real estate, 20% in basket clause, 20% in global securities. Those types of restrictions were put into the model so that we would make sure we're always complying with 314. And then kind of later on is when we get to the implementation part, and we'll start adding managers at that point. So it's a little, cart before the horse if we started trying to put managers in before we kind of wrap up with the asset allocation. Page 5 or 16. I do want to point out that asset allocation, while we would love this to be like a perfect science, it's really a lot of guesswork. And it's really important to kind of remember that as we go through this. I will often kind of reference something my shop teacher taught me back in 7th grade, is when you're trying to be incredibly precise and you're doing woodworking, he would often tell me, Chris, that's sawdust on the floor, right? When you start measuring to a 1/16 of an inch, the saw blade itself is thicker than that, and you're not going to be able to get to be that precise. That's a lot how asset allocation works. It's not a precise science. We're dealing with projections for the asset classes, and that's a big unknown. And even the smartest people out there just come up with what we would say are educated guesses that we know are probably going to be pretty far off at any given time. So we do want to make sure we understand that. The other thing that these models, it's very hard for them to work with, is that the return patterns for these asset classes aren't normal. So if you think back to your stats class where you have that perfect bell curve, and for everything on the left side, there's one on the right side. Well, that's not how the real world works. We get a lot more of those left-hand tail events than we should. Those are the bad events, right? All of a sudden the market's down 30%. It should only happen once every 100 years, but we get it once every 10. As I said, those types of things really are hard to factor into the model. So as I said, I want everyone to recognize that when we look at these numbers that come out of the model, it's just a rough estimate of what might happen. And I think page 6 kind of gives you an idea of why this is. So what we have here are the asset classes that we're going to be looking at, and all we're doing is putting the expected return, that's kind of the middle of those bars, and then the gray bar shows you one standard deviation movement. So that should capture about 66% of your observations. And so if you look at some of those equity ones, you'll note like there is a big difference between +1 and -1 standard deviation. And so when we do that, you have to recognize that even being off just a little bit on the if the markets just move a little bit outside of that standard, within what we would say is the acceptable range, it still could be widely different, right? The difference between getting 0 and 10 kind of fall within that one standard deviation pretty easily, but that's a big difference if U.S. equities get you 10 versus 0. And so these bars kind of give you that idea of how much risk is within the asset classes, and that we can move up and down those bars pretty easily in any time period. And I think last year is a perfect example. We had the first quarter, the market's down 30, and then we had the second, the last 2/3 or 3/4 of last year, and the market makes it all back and then some. And so literally we had two extremes within a 12-month period that would fall outside of those standard deviations that we're looking at here. So as I said, it's a very imprecise science. Page 7 has your correlation statistics. All that means is how do these asset classes behave with each other. The example I often use is, think of going to the beach. You see a vendor down there. He's selling sunscreen and umbrellas, like the sun umbrellas. He probably does pretty good on sunny days, but maybe not so good on rainy days. Maybe if he has rain slickers, he would sell those on the rainy days. Those behave different. That's exactly what this is showing you. The closer the numbers are to 1, or the darker the green they are, the more alike they are, which means that it doesn't help you to put in a whole bunch of things that are dark green, because they're all going to go up together and they're all going to go down together. What you want are some of those other asset classes that are like in the blues. So those are the ones that don't behave just like those. So as I said, that's the idea, of trying to mix and match those together to get a little better risk containment within the portfolio. And page 8 gives you some historical data on the projections for these asset classes. It just shows you that every year they change. So we have back in 2018, 2019, 2020, and then 2021, and we actually do the math for you between last year and this year. And so what you can see is when they're in gray, basically it's moving against you, and if it's in green, it's moving for you, meaning like the green ones you can see are all under standard deviation. Lower standard deviations, but it's coming with a lower return expectation as well. So as I said, last year, you can see where the returns were, and they've basically all come down. And part of that's because the market did so good last year, right? Market moves up, valuations get higher, expected returns then kind of go down. You get a bad year in the market, it should go the opposite way. And these are like 10 to 15 year projections. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. We have them also on page 9. So that 10 to 15 year projection column, that's going to match up with the 2021 column that was on the page above it. But we're also showing here is the historical returns for these asset classes. And so if you look over the last 5 years, and I'm just coming across the top, that U.S. aggregate bonds, over the last 15 years, it's done 4.48. The new projection for it, you can see, is 2.16. So about half of what it's done over the last 15 years. You come across like large cap equities, you can see we're pretty consistently in the teens there until you get to the 9.3 at the 15-year mark. And now the new projection there is going to be about 5.1. So they're chopping those return expectations down significantly from where they have been over the last 15, 20 some years. And that's basically true across the board. You do note there are some asset classes I would say are still, above your 7.25 target. So if you're looking at like emerging markets equity, then some of the alternatives there, like private equity, kind of get you up there as well, into the 9s. They also have higher standard deviations associated. Once again, that's the risk, right? Some higher returning asset classes, but they come with higher risk statistics. And then at the very bottom, we show your current. So where you've been, the last 15 years, we'd modeled this out to be about a 7 3/4. And now the new projection is going to be about 5.7. So, page 10, slide 21, one more page up. This shows you some mixes that I put together. So we have the current mix. That is basically our target asset allocation from the IPS. And then mix 1 is actually a little bit more conservative. We've had some conversations, what if we trimmed some of our real estate? And so this actually takes about 8% away from real estate and actually puts it into small and mid-cap equities. So just kind of reshifting it from value-add real estate into domestic equities. Mix 2 actually looks very similar to our current mix. The difference here is we've shifted a little bit of the domestic equity portfolio down. So we're up a lot of money in large caps and less money in small and mid. This one, you actually have a little bit more in the small and mid and a little bit less in large cap, a little more balanced approach. Mix 3, I've started to trim some of the fixed income exposure. Now remember, we just looked at our projections for fixed income. It was just over 2% there. That is not going to help us get to our 7 1/4. So this one, we've shifted some from fixed income, put a little bit into the equity, and we actually added a little bit to the direct lending, the very last line coming down. You can see that goes from 3 to 5%. The current strategy we have there is Bloomfield, just so everyone can kind of think of what we're looking at when we talk about direct lending. And then in mix 4, we've shifted a little bit more out of fixed income and added private equity and took a little bit from the real estate. So, and then mix 5 is the actual optimized mix if you're trying to reach 7 1/4. And I'll point out, the forecasted return is 7.27. So it actually hits the 7 1/4. I will tell you, it's a really goofy looking portfolio. That's once again, some of the model doesn't know like diversification between small, mid, large caps. It just says, well, the best one from a risk return standpoint is small caps. So I'm going to put all my money in small caps because that's where you make more money. It also looks at real estate and says, oh, value add is better than core. I'm just going to put all my money into value add real estate. It puts as much as it can into that private equity as well. So you can see private equity and direct lending, 20%. That would hit our 314 max for our basket clause investments. And basically, it just skips over like developed markets equity, puts it all in emerging markets equity. It goes to the very riskiest parts of the different asset classes just to get that 7 1/4. So it's not what I would say a practical portfolio at all, but it does give you an idea of how the model thinks when you're trying to get these higher return numbers. It's just saying, where is the highest returns available? I have to put as much of that into the portfolio as possible and still get to that diversification and the constraints that would technically apply. You could do mix 5 and say, yes, 314 is, I'm abiding by what 314 says I need to do. So, any questions?
Jeff? A couple. On page 9, the 10 to 15-year forecast. Where did that information come from?
So we use the JP Morgan forecast, and I will tell you there's a number of different firms that put that data out. A lot of firms create their own forecast. I'm trying to see if we have that exhibit in this one.
Don't they tend to be conservative?
So I will tell you, that's kind of my issue, is I think they typically are a little bit overly conservative. And they rely on what they would say are, like historical relationships. And kind of the relationship that most of them use is this relationship between government bonds and equities. And basically they said, well, if government bonds did 8% historically and equities did 11, well, then equities do 3% better than government bonds. So now that a government bond pays 2, I have to say equities only pay 5. And I will point out that relationship isn't very strong, meaning that that 3% number holds sometimes, but doesn't hold other times. And so, and no one knows, like, is it just by happenstance that it happened that way? Or is there some actual reason for it? And the rationale they use is like, well, you demand to get paid more for going into a riskier asset class. So if this is what the historical relationship is, it must hold. But government bonds back in the 70s paid 10%. We haven't seen that in 30 years. But the equity markets over the last 30 years still have done like 10%. And now they're saying the next 10 to 15 years are going to only be 5. I will tell you, like, if you're a statistician and you looked at those return projections and said 5 and 5.2, how often has that actually happened over a 15-year period? And you went back to like 1925 when we start getting what we would say real data. You're like in the 90th percentile. So coming back to my bell curve, you're basically predicting one of like the 10% worst periods of time over the next 10 to 15 years. Personally, I would say that I wouldn't want to be on that island. I would want to fall somewhere in the middle, but go ahead.
No, my point was going to be, I assumed it was JP Morgan because you had them footnoted on other sheets. They are conservative. However, if you had 10 financial analysts in this room that were giving you a 10-year forecast, you'd have 10 different forecasts. But the point I want to make to the rest of the trustees is if everybody understands that JP Morgan is conservative, so when you look at these numbers, don't be sticker shocked at only 5% on equities. Because I could bring in a half a dozen analysts that will tell you it's going to be higher than that.
Well, I will tell you, they're not even the most conservative, though. There are groups out there that are going to be more conservative than them, like GMO. They're extremely conservative. They're probably maybe another % or 2 lower. And there are groups that are higher. I will tell you, none of them, are predicting 10% returns. And part of it, I will tell you, is also it's a lot better to be wrong and low than wrong and high, right? If I come in and say you're only going to get 6 and then you get 7, well, geez, bad on me, you guys got an extra 1%. But heaven forbid I say you get 8 and you get 7.9, then I missed, I was way overly optimistic about what was going to happen. So I think there's part of that baked in as well.
I did have one other question. On page 10, when you're looking at the mixes, the asset class allocations, you said the first column represents pretty much what we have right now. Does that represent the fact that we no longer have the low volatility and we're now into S&P 500 mix? Because I'm trying to understand your percentages here.
So all we were modeling is the asset class. So the fact that low vol, we considered large cap, S&P 500, we considered large cap.
Oh, okay, you've answered my question, thank you.
So all of them are mixed the same, or assuming kind of the same return, regardless of low vol versus the S&P.
Okay.
So just, what I would tell you, I think kind of makes sense, is moving towards mix 3 and 4. And I would tell you, mix 4 is probably a little bit past where we're at today. Meaning to make a 5% commitment to private equity today without having actually done any of the education in the space is, I would say, probably not the right idea. So the thought I have is kind of the idea of moving towards mix 3 or 4, but provide some additional education on some of those other asset classes that we'd be looking at. So,
Chris, would you be able to bring that back to us, mixes 3 and 4, and kind of what the projection of what you would anticipate versus what the current is?
yes, I think I can kind of show what it might look like between those. Now, how the portfolio structure, not necessarily the return numbers are probably going to be identical to what we see here, but the actual portfolio structure of the mixes, I can show you that.
If the return numbers are going to be pretty much the same, then why make the change?
Well, if like a mix 4 gets you 37 basis points higher, roughly. I think shifting money out of fixed income and into something else is going to put you in a better position going forward. I feel pretty confident that the fixed income's not going to get you your 7.25. We're currently getting, I think, about 2% in income on that portfolio. You'd need interest rates to go to, negative something to get to 7. And then once you do that, you would need them to go to negative something minus something to get, there again. So there's, I would say, a floor, or there's a ceiling, I guess, on what we're going to be able to do in fixed income. And so moving those assets into something that, gets you better forecasted returns makes sense to me. And that's where I would say, mix 3 and 4, we're going from about 22, down to, 18, 16, somewhere in that neighborhood. I think that, the retirement system will be in a better position performance-wise doing that. It's finding the home for those assets. And part of it would be like, do we want to add direct emerging market exposure to the portfolio? Or just kind of continue with the approach we've had with First Eagle and WCM, where we get a little bit of exposure through those strategies. We actually modeled out about a 5% allocation and trimmed those managers back to 5 each. That was kind of, that would give you a little more octane in the portfolio. It comes with more risk.
Jeff?
I think another question that I would like to see when we get to that point is how our current managers are doing in relationship to benchmarks. Because I'm not opposed to keeping our current managers and giving them more money. Like you're talking increasing mid cap and small cap and in mix 3. Mm-hmm. So I'm not opposed to doing that, but I want to see how they're doing in relationship to benchmarks. Because if they're not doing that well, then maybe we should be talking other things too.
No, I would tell you, I think you actually have a good roster. The thought is in mid-cap, we're using the S&P 400 benchmark. It's an index fund with BlackRock. I don't have any issue with that. I think performance has been spot on with that. It's pretty competitive amongst its peer group. It's incredibly cheap. I would be all for giving them some more money. The thought is maybe keeping Earnest, but partnering them on the small cap side, because instead of having 10% with a single active manager, maybe it's 5%. And as I said, finding a partner for them. That's one of the things we're working on for you right now. And then as the idea in that international space, you're probably 2 to 3% total fund allocated to the emerging markets. You have a little bit. As I said, the idea is that's one of the areas where everyone thinks you're going to get better returns. Maybe we want someone who's dedicated to that space. So that would be like one new manager, not doing anything with First Eagle or WCM other than bringing their allocation down a little bit to make room for a partner in that space. And in the case of, So let's say we're kind of looking at like 3 and 4, and we go through the private equity education, and the board says, you know what, not for us. We get it. Those dollars then can just be reallocated back to the domestic equity portfolio or the international equity portfolio. So we could be looking at like a mix 4, but instead of the 5% being in PE or private equity, we just put, 2% more on the international side and 3% more on the domestic equity side. And, have very similar type results to what we're looking at here. So. But that's kind of the next step, is to talk about some of these other areas, emerging markets, private equity, direct lending. Those are some of the higher returning ones, but they also introduce new risk. So, as I have kind of my little marching orders here about modeling the strategies out and then providing some education to the trustees.
All right, does anybody have any other questions? Seeing none, do we want to entertain a motion to accept and file the report?
So I can make that motion now? It's still good. Motion to accept and file the report from Chris.
Support.
Been moved and supported. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. Next item you have a C4, schedule of billing and expenses through May 31st. What's your pleasure?
Make a motion to support, or to accept the report? Yeah.
Your support?
Simpson support.
Been moved, it's been supported. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next, we have C5, schedule of new retirees through May 31st. What's your pleasure?
Motion to accept or approve, which do we need?
There you go, either or.
Support, Carpenter.
Been moved, it's been supported. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next item we have a schedule of deceased retirees through May 31st. What's your pleasure?
Motion to accept the schedule?
Support.
It's been moved, it's been supported. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next item, we have a C7, scheduled of reemployed retirees through May 31st. What's your pleasure?
We do have one, Mr. Wright was over again for the second month, and I did send another letter. Yes, we don't do anything till the third month, though, so.
I thought it was 60 days.
We still need a motion. Been moved and supported. Frank?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought it was after 60 days that this individual would have some consequences. Am I wrong there?
We do the second notice because
Okay.
he's had 2 notices before, and then he usually corrects it by the third.
Okay,
So if it comes to the
Okay.
next board meeting, then it would be to stop his pension.
okay. All right, thank you.
Place the
Yeah.
game.
Do you have
No,
any?
my question was answered.
Thank you. All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next, we have approval of education workshops for 2021. What's your pleasure?
Motion to approve.
Support.
Support. It's been moved and supported. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Next item we have is the item 9, legal report, Van Overbeck, Mashad, Timoney, and Judd. Frank, you're up.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate one more month of remote attendance, and I look forward to seeing everybody at the next meeting in person. I'm in Phoenix with Dan golfing. I mean, if that comes up, I just might have to go. The items that I already touched upon were the transfer of funds for the Comerica lowball account and the other governmental service policy update. So before you really only have the securities litigation reports from Labaton and Robbins Geller. Your Labaton report only has one small update. The Is the Fix case had an objection again, right? We had that Fortinbras group come in and sort of refile an objection with some new evidence. And the court requested a letter responding to their objection. The due date for that letter was June 10th. The letter has been filed. The judge hasn't done anything with it yet. That would be a pretty quick turnaround. So as of today, there is no final decision from the judge and no dates for distribution yet. I would hope the judge would turn his decision around pretty quickly on that. And I would hope that it would deny the objection. And then distribution would proceed. So hopefully at the July meeting, we've got a little clearer picture of where we're headed with that. Other than that, there are no new cases recommended and no other updates on any actions pending. So unless there's questions, that would be the end of my report.
Thank you. Are there any questions from anyone? Chair will entertain a motion to accept the legal report.
I'll support John's motion.
It's been moved, it's been supported. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item we have.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, go
I
ahead.
need to ask a question on something. The conferences and training sessions that we approved per this sheet says October the 16th. It's a one-day trustee master program for IF. In the literature I got today, the packages, is a IF conference for the following 3 or 4 days. My thinking is this should be added to what we just approved. We only approved a one-day session, whereas the whole conference starts the day after the 16th and runs through the 20th. This is a pre-conference item. Does that make sense what I just said?
I understood it.
You want to make a motion
Getting
to
better here.
amend the schedule?
So we need to make a motion to amend to include all of the IF conference, which runs from the pre-conference material, which is probably October the 16th, through October the 20th is the date on this brochure.
Okay. Does everybody understand that? And can you, Jennifer, also make sure that you get that information out to everybody?
I will.
So that had been moved. Is there support for it?
Support.
Been supported. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. All right, next item we have is D, informational items, Fall Mapers Conference, September 18th through the 21st at Doubletree Hotel, Bay City, Michigan. Moving on, item E, upcoming conferences. Again, is the Mapers September 18th, 21 conference in Bay City, with the conference attendees being Jeff Carpenter, Tracy Kahn, John Mandelaris, and bless you. So, is there anything else from anybody at this time? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make motion to adjourn?
And move and support. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.